democracy and human rights, utopia or pathway? And from what angle can we look at the question? I would be tempted to apply a chronological method on the basis of my three positions. In 78, 82, I was attaché at the embassy in Burundi. 6 years after the genocide in 72, then in Rwanda from 1990 to 1994. A period that took place before the genocide, or right up to the beginning of the genocide, and from 2004 to 2008 in the DRC, in a post-conflict situation, looking for a democratic path, and where elections took place in 2006 for the very first time since independence. There were pluralistic, multi-party elections. But I would like to choose a thematic angle by raising the question, which seems essential to me, out of democracy and human rights in the Great Lakes region. Is it a utopia, or is it a process, a dynamic process, which it is interesting to look into and to accompany if required? During my diplomatic career, I was able to note that democracy and/or human rights are major criteria, amongst others, of course, on the basis of which we can measure the level and the quality of our diplomatic relations, bilaterally or multilaterally. Those relations are linked and are conditioned by the progress achieved in our partner countries on that utopia. In Burundi, from 1978 to 1982, the debate on democracy was scarcely existed. The memory of the genocide against the Hutu of 1972 was fresh in the memories, and it was the respect for human rights which was stressed. And my cooperation minister asked a lot of questions on whether the human rights were respected in Burundi or not. In Rwanda, our diplomacy was committed from 19 to 1994, was committed to power sharing, to democracy and to human rights. We supported the moderate politicians, those who were in favor and working for democracy and human rights. The people who were in favor of democracy were looked at favorably and even sympathetically, because their claims were not just the return and the reintegration of Tutsi refugees, but they also aimed at democratic pluralism, which was due to be installed in Rwanda. Because you might remember that President Mitterrand, in his speech at the Franco-African Summit at La Baule in June 1990, had launched that pleading. He referred to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and he stated that there was a spirit of liberation that blew on democracies in Europe, and it would be a good thing for that same wind of change to blow in Africa. 10 years down the line, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, I was able to note to what extent the democracy was considered to be a Western import. The president who had won the elections in 2006 led me to understand that he considered the organization of elections as something which enabled him to fulfill the requirements imposed upon him by the international community, and notably the European Union. He'd done his homework. He had done all he could for democracy to be set up. Now, that is an erroneous perception. It is a missed opportunity to introduce a culture which would be authentically democratic and African. And I'm convinced that Burundi and also Rwanda will one day, maybe, find their own democratic formula, which would be their own, which would be authentic, and it would enable the minority and the majority to get along together. I would like to tell you a story because I mentioned a difference of approach towards democracy and human rights. It is important for me to tell you a personal story, which I experienced personally, which leads me to believe in democracy in Africa. During the 2006 elections, those were the first really pluralistic elections since Congo achieved independence. I was an observer in an election booth, and a very old Congolese man came to see me, and he said, "John, I'm the ambassador from Belgium?" And I said, "Yes." And he said to me, well, I'm really proud because it's the first time today that I can vote and that my ballot actually has weight in a democratic process, because since the elections, just before independence in June 1960, and then he said something quite remarkable, which I repeat on every occasion: Mr. Ambassador, I have an appointment with my dignity today. I have an appointment with my dignity. But I would like to draw some conclusions, but I would like to make observations first of all. First of all, we should not lose sight of the weaknesses and the defects or even the crises in European democracies, in Belgium, in France, in Canada maybe also, within the European Union. We are faced with situations which should lead us not to give too many lessons. We don't need to go into detail. Then it is important to recognize that human rights risk being threatened in our own societies, which are more and more dominated by digitization, algorithms, in artificial intelligence and robots. Some elementary basic rights are difficult to preserve in the fight against terrorism. The freedom of expression, the right to asylum are no longer defended with as much determination as in the recent past. And lastly, I would like to refer to the thesis which is developed in the book Why Nations Fail. It states that the failure of many countries is linked to the weakness of their institutions, because you can have the best laws in the world, you can have the best politicians, you can have the best vision, the best projects for the future, but if the country doesn't have properly functioning institutions, it is really difficult to believe in a real development for that country. And I don't exaggerate when I say that since the the elections in the Congo in 2006, the country has made scarcely any progress in the functioning of its institutions. But that is the mandatory basis to be able to make solid and durable progress. And I refer there to the 5 major works to be carried out in the president's speech when he was elected on the 6th of December 2006. And to go further, I wonder to what extent authoritarianism at the head of the state will enable Rwandan institutions to play a real and lasting role in the country. Mr. Moderator, is there a relation between democracy and human rights? I'm sure there is. Both concepts are linked to one another. They are closely linked. They are at the origin of the concept. They're a condition and a consequence, one of the other. They give legitimacy to one another and reinforce one another. If you do not respect human rights, the state of law is a concept which is void. It is the guardian of democracy, and that will give the best guarantees for real development of human rights. So now I would like to make a few observations as to what we are living through right now. Belgium and the European Union and other countries had proclaimed loudly the need for new elections in the DRC, and they had been planned for before 2018. The Congolese politicians had to make haste because the date was it was well past the date for the elections. The president could not put himself forward for another mandate, and the ballot, as well as the counting of the votes, gave rise to massive fraud. Instead of protesting, that would have been logical because of the speeches before the elections. Well, instead of protesting or asking for recount, the international community fell back onto realpolitik. That is the situation all quiet on the Western Front. The population is tired. We don't want any new instabilities, so we will not destabilize the institutions, but we will make sure that the new institutions are able to operate responsibly so that they can carry out proper governance. And that complacency would be acceptable if there had also been a re-examination of that talk about democracy and elections. In Rwanda, we capitulate when human rights are trodden underfoot. I'll just give one example, because we can't go through all the examples. Other speakers will raise them. Well, the silence and the discretion in our media and of our politicians following the mysterious demise of the singer Kizito, and it is quite regrettable, or even it is to be condemned. I cannot leave aside the dangers that threaten Burundi, where another destabilization is in the offing. There is new destabilization in prospect, and the elections which are planned for May might well be postponed because of serious violations. Ladies and gentlemen, having made those observations, I would like to share with you the following comment, the following thought. Democracy is a universal value which must be promoted and encouraged throughout the world. However, is it necessary for we, the international community, to interfere? Do we need to make sure that democracy is actually implemented concretely? I'm not just speaking about organizing elections, but isn't it up to the states themselves to work on their democracy on the basis of their own culture, on the basis of their own practices and their own rhythms? Each democracy is entitled to its own rules, its own life, without being considered as a magic formula, a golden bullet imported from the outside, which can be applied without any change whatsoever by all countries. But when there I come on to human rights, when the citizen risks being intimidated, discriminated against, imprisoned, or even worse, when the citizen dares to ask questions even, or when he criticizes, or when citizens set up or join an opposition party, i.e. when the citizens use their basic human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, there we must take note that fundamental human rights are not applied and respected. And at that is why I would say we cannot apply relativism. The international community has to intervene, has to step in. I think that the concern then disappears. It expresses itself less clearly for some time. Maybe there is cynicism or caution or competition with other major powerful factors at the international level. The respect for human rights in the DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, or throughout the world, including in Belgium and in France, that is in our interest. It is not only a moral obligation, a legal or political obligation, it is also self-interest. I shall conclude, Chairman. I hope that citizens, wherever they are, will be able to take part fully in societies where there is legal certainty, rule of law, proper political circumstances, a real civil society where good governance is not just an empty word and where human dignity is put in front, is at the top of the values. It's an aim for us all, and not only for the countries in the Great Lakes region. In diplomacy, the mission of the diplomat, I believe, is to find a middle way between complacency and arrogance. And to find that middle way and to remain on that middle path, we have to invest in interest, respect, availability for dialogue, and in the culture of trust. That is a task for diplomacy, indeed, but even more for all stakeholders, all people in charge within our democracies. It is a long-term work which requires patience and with maturity of spirit. If we manage to marry that discourse and the practice, we will be able to talk about a dynamic, a process, and not a utopian ideal. Thank you.